The modern weakness is that denunciation of sin is not balanced by confession of sin. The true reason for hating crime is not that we could not commit it, but that we could. A better reason still for hating crime is that we have committed it.
In the last program, we started talking about the 7 deadly sins. It was painful, I know. And what's worse, we didn't finish. But talking about them for another half hour will be better than contemplating them for an eternity. Trust me. We've already dealt with pride, avarice, and envy. There are 4 more only. We'll start with anger. It seems that whenever we talk about our own anger, we try to defend it. We refer to justifiable anger or righteous indignation. But the need for those adjectives indicates that anger is generally not justifiable and not righteous. The excuse given for righteous indignation is that it's a reaction to some injustice. It is perhaps justifiable if it leads to positive action, to works of compassion, and does not lead us to sin. In any case, anger must always be controlled. St. James tells us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. The other word for righteousness is justice. So, the anger of man does not work the justice of God, which is probably why St. Paul reminds us of God's words, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay." It's not up to us to work out God's justice, only His mercy. As St. James tells us, mercy triumphs over judgment. We get angry at weeds, but if we're not careful in our rage, we'll end up tearing up the food and the flowers as well. God has given us the limits of our behavior, and it is within those limits that we are free, because we can control our actions. It's outside of those limits that the actions control us. Think of how awkward it is to be around someone who has flown off the handle, or someone who's in a frightful rage. Anger is a deadly sin because it's a loss of control, and it's often a very deadly loss of control, as in second-degree murder. And think of the term, all the rage. It refers to a kind of popular madness that we call fashion, when an idea sweeps up the crowd rather than the crowd sweeping up the idea. Most things that are the rage pass very quickly, thank God, but not, unfortunately, without doing damage. And there is, more often than not, a real connection between anger and fashion. Too often we're seduced by the new because we're angry at the old, upset with the past, and resentful of tradition. Most anger comes from not having thought things out. We may unleash our anger at something in particular, like a drawer that won't open. But if we think about it, it's not really the drawer's fault that it doesn't open. Shall we really give the drawer that much power over us that we should act like fools because we cannot get it open? Most anger is pointed, and yet it is unfocused. It can't be defined, and it can't be defended. Think of the anger of feminists. Think of the obscene defiance of militant homosexuals. They're riled up with resentment. They claim to be fighting for freedom and dignity, but their behavior is anything but dignified. And their claims about freedom fly in the face of their slavery to their own passions. They aim their anger at the church, whose teachings certainly condemn their behavior, but where does their anger really come from, and where does it really lead them?
Men who begin to fight the church for the sake of freedom and humanity end by flinging away freedom and humanity, if only they may fight the church.
This is the problem with rage. It leads to bad behavior. It also leads to bad thinking. We use the word mad to mean angry, but the word mad originally meant crazy, as in madness. But there's a connection between rage and madness. There's a connection between anger and lunacy. Both represent a loss of reason, as well as a loss of the virtue of operating within the normal limits of behavior. For Chesterton, most modern philosophy is madness, or leads to madness. But most modern philosophy is also edgy and angry because it's rebellious. It's based on the rejection of the church's teachings and a divorce of faith and reason. When Chesterton refers to the deadly sin of anger, he does not often talk about anger per se, but about the swelling of negative emotions that make us lose control. In other words, bad moods. People who leave the church usually don't flee because they have carefully thought things out and found a superior creed somewhere else. They usually leave because they're in a bad mood. It is a bad mood that makes us neglect our commitments and forget our creeds. And as Chesterton says, the whole purpose of a religion with a fixed creed is that it helps us survive our moods. The next deadly sin is gluttony. Now let's start by pointing out that smoking is not a sin. Drinking is not a sin. And for the record, dancing is not a sin, although if you ever saw me dance, you'd understand why it should be prohibited. Eating is not evil. Neither is smoking or drinking. It's not the act that is evil, but the act getting out of control. It is not only a misunderstanding of the sin of gluttony to condemn a simple pleasure rather than the abuse of that pleasure, it's an attack on freedom.
It is a savage trait to talk about material substances instead of about ideas. The old civilization talked about the sin of gluttony or excess. We talk about the problem of drink, as if drink could be a problem. When people have come to call the problem of human intemperance the problem of drink, and to talk about curing it by attacking the drink traffic, they have reached quite a dim stage of barbarism. The thing is an inverted form of fetish worship. It is no sillier to say that a bottle is a god than to say that a bottle is a devil.
It is not drink, but drunkenness that is evil. Anything that takes away our free will is evil. If we're slaves of mere appetite, then we're no different from animals. The church calls for fasting for the simple reason that it gives us a chance to demonstrate that we are spiritual creatures as well as physical creatures, and that we can rule our appetites rather than having our appetites rule us. To deny a simple pleasure is a simple form of sacrifice. To indulge in a simple pleasure until it ceases even to be a pleasure is sin. It's gluttony. There's a time for feasting, just as there's a time for fasting. You cannot perpetually feast, just as you cannot perpetually fast. Too much pleasure destroys pleasure. Chesterton says that a man should keep sober enough to praise wine. And he gives us a second rule for drinking, which, like other sound rules, is a paradox.
Drink because you are happy, but never because you are miserable. Never drink when you are wretched without it, or you will be like the grave-faced gin drinker in the slum. But drink when you would be happy without it, and you will be like the laughing peasants of Italy. Never drink because you think you need it, for this is rational drinking, and the way to death and hell. But drink because you do not need it, for this is irrational drinking, and the ancient health of the world.
Now, as for overeating, there are some people who assume that G.K. Chesterton was fat because he ate too much, that perhaps he was a glutton. But Chesterton scholars, both of them, disagree about the reason for Chesterton's great size. One scholar even contends that he wasn't really that big, at least not disproportionately so. Weighing in on this large subject, Chesterton's secretary, Dorothy Collins, let it be known that she was amazed at how little he ate. We know that he joked about his great size, and we also know that he freely and humbly admitted his faults. But he never thought that gluttony was one of them. so he probably wasn't a glutton. Fatness is not a sin. As Chesterton says, the thin monks were holy, but I'm sure the fat monks were humble. The next deadly sin is lust. This is the one that you've been waiting for. But if you think that I'm going to talk about sex, you're wrong. I'm going to let Chesterton talk about it.
The first two facts which a healthy boy or girl feels about sex are these. First, that it is beautiful, and then that it is dangerous. All people have an absolutely clean instinct in this matter. Mankind declares with one deafening voice that sex may be ecstatic, so long as it is also restricted. Now, it is not necessary that the restriction should be reasonable. It is only necessary that it should restrict. That is the beginning of all purity, and purity is the beginning of all passion. In other words, the creation of conditions for love, or even for flirting, is common sense. You see, all healthy men, ancient and modern, Western and Eastern, hold that there is in sex a fury that we cannot afford to inflame, and that a certain mystery must attach to the instinct if it is to be sane. There are people who maintain that they can talk about this topic as coldly and openly as about any other. There are people who maintain that they would walk naked down the street. But these people are not only insane, they are, in the most emphatic sense of the word, stupid. They do not think. They only point, as children do, and ask why. Why cannot we discuss sex coolly and rationally anywhere? This is a tired and unintelligent question. It is like asking, why does not a man walk on his hands as well as on his feet? It is silly. If a man walked systematically on his hands, they would not be hands, but feet. And if love or lust were things that we could all discuss without any possible emotion, they would not be love or lust. They would be something else, some mechanical function or abstract natural duty which may or may not exist in animals or in angels, but which has nothing at all to do with sex. Sex is not an unconscious or innocent thing, but an intense and powerful thing, special and violent emotional stimulation that is at once spiritual and physical. A man who asks us to have no emotions in sex is asking us to have no emotions about emotion. It may be said of him, in the strict meaning of the words, that he does not know what he is talking about. There is such a thing as a system of deliberate erotic stimulants. It is called pornography. This is not a thing to be argued about with one's intellect, but to be stamped on with one's heel. If a man tries to excite a sex instinct which is already too strong, he must be a scoundrel. Sex, you see, is not a thing like eating and sleeping. There is something dangerous and disproportionate in its place in human nature, for whatever reason. And it does really need a special purification and dedication. If sex is treated merely as one innocent natural thing among others, what happens is that every other innocent natural things become soaked and sodden with sex. The moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant.
Okay, let's talk about something else. Sloth, the last one on the list of the 7 deadly sins. Interestingly enough, other than pride, the deadliest of the deadly sins, Chesterton wrote about sloth more than he wrote about any of the others. perhaps because it was, by his own admission, his own greatest weakness, which is hard to imagine if you consider how much he wrote. In fact, he complained that he never had enough nothing to do. Sloth is not just laziness, it is neglect of duty. If the other deadly sins involve actively doing the wrong thing, sloth is the passive sin of failing to do the right thing.
A man may be naturally slothful and rather irresponsible. He may neglect many duties through carelessness, and his friends may still understand him, so long as it is really a carelessness. But it is work of the devil when a man engages in careful carelessness. It is the work of the devil when a man becomes a deliberate and self-conscious bohemian, despising better men than himself, men who work that he may waste.
The classification of the deadly sins came about in the Middle Ages. Chesterton argues that this was the period in our civilization when common sense was at its peak. Common sense is about balance and proportion, maintaining everything in its proper place. And so, Chesterton says that what the medievals meant by dividing and labeling the 7 deadly sins was that a man might fall into one of these sins when fleeing too far from another. For instance, a man who neglects his business may fall into sloth. A man who pursues his business may fall into avarice. But after the Renaissance, that balance was lost. Some vices were unleashed on the excuse that others might be exterminated. As Chesterton says, the pagans went in for unlimited lust, and the Puritans for unlimited avarice, on the excuse that neither of them was guilty of sloth. It's one of the ironies about the sin of sloth in the modern world. It's customary to associate dirt with evil because it's considered evidence of sloth. But as Chesterton points out, the classes that wash most are those that work least. He also points out that though sloth is the vice most condemned in modern business, it's the sin most indulged in the modern brain. Our brains show real signs of sluggishness and inactivity. Thinking is hard work, and we generally avoid it.
It is customary to complain of the bustle and strenuousness of our epoch, but in truth the chief mark of our time is a profound laziness and fatigue. And ironically, the real laziness is the cause of our apparent bustle. The streets are noisy with taxicabs and motor cars, but this is not due to human activity, but rather to human repose. There would be less bustle if there were more activity, if people were simply walking about. Our world would be more silent if it were more strenuous. And what is true of the apparent physical bustle is also true of the apparent bustle of the intellect. Most of the machinery of modern language is labor-saving machinery. The problem is that it saves mental labor very much more than it ought. Scientific phrases are used like scientific wheels and piston rods to make swifter and smoother yet the path of the comfortable. Long words go rattling by us like long railway trains, but I fear they are carrying thousands who are too tired or too indolent to walk and think for themselves. It is a good exercise to try to express any opinion one holds in words of one syllable.
Although money is the motive for creating labor-saving devices, laziness is the motive for buying such devices. And Chesterton says that we are dreaming of a machine that will render needless the labor of thinking. We already use catchwords as substitutes for thinking, and thereby we limit our vocabulary along with the use of our brains. In popular science, we use the names Darwin and Einstein as if we knew all that is meant by those names, but we don't know. And we're not ready to pick up the tools of logic and put them to work to test modern philosophies. And the only alternative to logic, says Chesterton, is laziness. We talked about sloth being a passive sin. Passiveness can lead to what Chesterton calls the unpardonable sin of being bored. Boredom, he says, is the next condition to death, a decay of vitality. Boredom also represents the loss of imagination, which is one of God's greatest gifts. And the passiveness of boredom, of failing to do the right thing, can lead to despair, a morbid helplessness to do the right thing. And despair can lead to the most unimaginable sin of all, suicide. All sin is an act of selfishness, and suicide is the ultimate act of selfishness. It's the act of sloth. It's giving up the fight. Chesterton did not pull any punches when talking about this horrible topic.
Not only is suicide a sin, it is the sin. It is the ultimate and absolute evil. The refusal to take an interest in existence. The refusal to take the oath of loyalty to life. The man who kills a man kills a man. The man who kills himself kills all men. As far as he is concerned, he wipes out the whole world. His act is worse than any rape or dynamite outrage, for it destroys all buildings. It insults all women. The thief is satisfied with diamonds, but the suicide is not. That is his crime. The thief compliments the things he steals, if not the owner of them. But the suicide insults everything on earth by not stealing it. He defiles every flower by refusing to live for its sake. There is not a tiny creature in the cosmos at whom his death is not a sneer. When a man hangs himself on a tree, the leaves might fall off in anger, and the birds fly away in fury. For each has received a personal affront. Of course, there may be pathetic, emotional excuses for the act. There often are for rape and for dynamite. But the crime of suicide is different from other crimes, for it makes even crimes impossible.
Sin never sets anyone free. Only the truth can set us free. Chesterton found the truth when he discovered the Catholic faith. He says that the more he considered Christianity, the more he found that while it had established rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild. And he eventually came to embrace the Catholic Church, which he found to be the greatest defender of reason and liberty in the modern world. None of the modern philosophies proved to be as good, and almost all of the modern philosophies tried in some way to do away with sin. Every good thing can be perverted. Every bad thing can be whitewashed. The modern world has tried to take the 7 deadly sins and transform them into virtues, to exalt them and give them a new name. We have exalted lust by calling it free love or gay rights. We have exalted avarice by calling it economic opportunity. We've exalted envy by calling it the drive to succeed. We've exalted anger by calling it assertiveness. We've exalted sloth by calling it tolerance. And we've exalted pride by calling it self-esteem. As Chesterton says, a new philosophy generally means the praise of some old vice. The best thing for us is to treat sin honestly, to admit that it is sin. And the best place to talk about it honestly is in the confessional. I'm Dale Ahlquist. Join us again for the Apostle of Common Sense.